the government program that destroyed the car market. Let's talk about the infamous Cash for Clunkers program, officially called the Car Allowance Rebate System, or CARS for short. This was a short-lived government program launched in 2009 during the Great Recession. And while it was marketed as a stimulus for the auto industry and an environmentally friendly initiative, its ripple effects were far more damaging than most people realize. So, what was Cash for Clunkers? Essentially, it was a government-run trade-in program where people who owned older, less fuel-efficient vehicles could bring them into participating dealerships and trade them in for a government rebate toward the purchase of a brand new, more fuel-efficient car. The rebates typically ranged from $3,500 to $4,500, depending on how much more efficient the new vehicle was compared to the one being scrapped. The idea was to kill two birds with one stone: help struggling automakers like GM, Ford, and Chrysler by spurring new car sales, and simultaneously take gas-guzzling, high-emission vehicles off the road. On paper, that might sound like a win-win, but once you dig into how it worked, the details tell a very different story. So here's how the process worked. A car owner would bring in an older vehicle that met the requirements, typically something that got less than 18 miles per gallon. The dealership would then verify that the vehicle was drivable, had been insured and registered for at least a year, and qualified under the program. Once approved, the customer could receive the rebate from the government. Again, $3,500 to $4,500 to put toward the cost of a brand new car. But here's the key part. The old vehicle, the so-called clunker, wasn't allowed to be resold on the used car market. It had to be permanently disabled and scrapped. Dealerships were instructed to pour sodium silicate, known as liquid glass, into the engine, run it until it seized, and then send the vehicle off to the scrapyard. That meant these cars were completely destroyed. Unusable, unsalvageable, gone. Now let's talk about the types of cars that were traded in. A lot of people picture rusty old beaters with 200,000 miles on them, but that's not what happened. Many of the vehicles that qualified were still running perfectly well, had plenty of life left in them, and were popular among working-class Americans who relied on affordable used cars. We're talking about full-size SUVs like the Ford Explorer, Chevy Blazer, and Jeep Grand Cherokee, pickup trucks like the Ford F-150, Chevy Silverado, and Dodge Ram. Even some well-running sedans were destroyed, cars that families could have purchased for a fraction of the price of a new car. These weren't junkers ready for the scrap heap. They were vehicles that people on a budget could have kept on the road for years to come. So, how long did the program actually last? It was launched in July 2009 with a $1 billion budget, but the demand was so high that the money ran out within just 1 week. Congress then authorized an additional $2 billion, but even with the extension, the entire program ended after only about a month. In total, it ran for less than 30 days, ending in August 2009. But in that short window, nearly 700,000 vehicles were destroyed. Think about that number. 700,000 running drivable vehicles gone forever. Now let's get into the fallout, because this is where the destroyed the car market part really comes into play. At first, the program did create a spike in new car sales. Automakers loved it, dealers loved it, and politicians pointed to it as proof that government stimulus could work. But that sales bump was artificial. Instead of generating long-term demand, it simply pulled forward purchases that would have happened anyway. People who were already planning to buy a new car within the next year just did it a little sooner to take advantage of the rebate. Once the program ended, sales plummeted, leaving the market right back where it started. Except with one major difference. The used car supply had been decimated. By destroying hundreds of thousands of perfectly good vehicles, the program created a massive shortage in the used car market. Prices for used vehicles shot up almost immediately, and that effect lasted for years. Working-class Americans who couldn't afford brand new cars suddenly faced higher prices on the used car lot. The very people who most needed affordable transportation, the students, the single parents, the low-income workers, were the ones hurt the most. Meanwhile, people who had the financial means to buy new cars were the ones who benefited from the rebates. In other words, it ended up being a wealth transfer from taxpayers to middle and upper-class car buyers, while punishing the lower class that depended on used cars. And the irony is, it wasn't even that effective from an environmental standpoint. Yes, the program took less efficient cars off the road, But the fuel economy gains weren't as dramatic as advertised. In many cases, people traded in an SUV that got 15 miles per gallon for a brand new SUV that got maybe 20 or 22 miles per gallon. That's an improvement, sure, but not the kind of massive environmental win that was promised. And when you factor in the emissions created by manufacturing hundreds of thousands of new vehicles, remember, building a new car requires energy, materials, and shipping. The overall environmental benefit was marginal at best. So in the end, cash for clunkers lasted just 1 month, destroyed nearly 700,000 drivable vehicles, spiked new car sales temporarily, but left the used car market gutted for years afterward. It raised prices for working families, it gave only modest environmental benefits, and it cost taxpayers about $3 billion for the privilege. Some analysts later calculated that the government spent about $24,000 per vehicle in subsidies when you break down the costs versus the benefits. It was, by most measures, a policy failure. That's why many people look back on cash for clunkers as the government program that destroyed the car market. It was a short-term gimmick with long-term consequences, and we're still living with some of the effects today. Used car prices remain historically high, and the supply of affordable vehicles has never really recovered from that artificial shock to the system. When you eliminate hundreds of thousands of perfectly good cars in a single month, you can't just snap your fingers and replace them. The market takes years, sometimes decades, to recover. So when you hear politicians today talk about big government stimulus programs, it's worth remembering cash for clunkers. It was sold as a win-win, but in reality it hurt the very people it was supposed to help. And that's why it deserves the title, the government program that destroyed the car market.